So yes, thank you again, Jane, and I'd like to extend that thanks to everybody at Winters, because it's been probably longer than I can really track, but it's been a while. But I'm over halfway through my PhD now, and it's been, every time I go into Winters, it's down tools, and we start talking about research, and we start talking about heritage and history. So apologies, Angela, for every time I get in, it's like the phones go on to answer phone, and the coffee comes out, and the biscuits come out, so it really has been so far a joyful experience. So I hope some of that excitement comes across tonight. And what I'm trying to do in my research and my work with Winters is, as Jane said, use Winters as the linchpin. So I was trying to think of the word, and linchpin's probably right. I was thinking of hub and nexus and all that kind of thing. But essentially what it means is that Winters become the standard by which I can measure, I can compare and contrast practices and trends that happened in Victorian photography, in Derby, in Great Britain, in the Empire, and across the world. So my question, which came up as part of this process of looking at lots and lots of photographs, and most of the photographs I've looked at have been cartes de visite, and I'll discuss those fairly shortly. Having seen so many photographs, the question arose, can they be regarded as the work of artists? Because without doubt, a lot of them, because there were many millions, appeared to be quite mundane. And yet, the word artist is used almost exclusively on the backs of the carte de visite cards, which I'll show you. So I wanted to drill down a bit further into this question, and to really set it up as two extremes. And those extremes are, can a photographer be an artist? Can a photographer ever be an artist? And I know that there were times in the history of photography when the answer to that was a resounding no. The other extreme is, must a photographer be an artist, or is a photographer always an artist? And there would have been some answers to that in history that would have said yes and again no. So I expect that, well, I know the ending of this, so it's somewhere in the middle of that. So we'll work our way towards that. But this is a question, or a set of questions, that really can be tracked back right to the birth of photography. So I was trying to get to answer the question in terms of how did the Victorian photography studios themselves describe themselves. And as we will see, the word artist and art is used a lot. Now, a 1980s photo historian called William Darragh, who was actually by trade or by profession a paleobotanist in Gettysburg, he was by passion a photo historian and specialised in cartes de visite and stereographs, and he produced the first definitive survey of cartes de visite. And I won't read you the whole quote, but essentially he said that few of them merit recognition as artists, but even the plodding artisans have left a truthful, irreplaceable record, a fragile and perishable heritage that deserves both appreciation and preservation. So that's the sort of starting point. I have to say, I don't attach that fairly pejorative description to Winters. You know, I'm looking beyond that. But it certainly makes the point that the great mass of photography that was produced by, as he says, tens of thousands of studios, and this is tens of thousands, probably multiples of that, because he was really focusing on the United States and Europe, but of course photography in the second half of the 19th century had moved well beyond that. So there is an enormous potential archive out there that we can use to tap into the sort of social history of the locality, because these most of these studios served their direct locality. They didn't, with a few exceptions, they didn't spread themselves far and wide. So one of the sources of information that I've addressed, apart from cast receipts, and I keep flagging that up, and I will come to it, are the trade directories. So trade directories are a fascinating study in themselves. There were at least 6 or 7 that covered most of the areas, Derby and Derbyshire and so on. Common names are the post office, they're still with us, Slaters, Kellys, Whites, Dixies, Morrises, and the list goes on and on. And they have given us an interesting, sometimes patchy record of who was interacting with who in 19th century Victorian trade and professional society. So this is clearly before Google, so it was the way that clients and customers could connect with their suppliers, and the way that suppliers could sell their services and goods excuse me, to their clients. And so I've addressed myself to pouring through directories. They are so fascinating that they're another avenue that can take up lots and lots of research time and just through the fascination of it. So one of the things I was trying to get to is, at what point did photographers start to enter the trade and professional environment? Because we know that from the birth of photography in the late 1830s to 1840, that was taken up both by gentlemen scientists and by artists who wanted to experiment with this new medium and produced some of the early art photographs. But that didn't really have an impact, didn't really gain traction on daily life of the trades and professions, mainly because it was centred on 2 principal competing technologies. One was the daguerreotype, which was an incredibly complex process to achieve, and it resulted in a beautiful, detailed but singular object. And those would be very often kept in plush-lined cases and kept as objects of virtue in and of themselves. But in comparison with the daguerreotype, the Fox-Talbot process produced a negative-positive, but certainly in the early days it wasn't really very good. And if you visit Laycock Abbey and see the early copies of Fox-Talbot's work, you see it's indistinct, and partly that's because they're somewhat fugitive, but also because they weren't that distinct very often in the first place. So the professional life of towns and cities up and down the country was waiting for something to happen, and we can track by looking at these directories when those things started to happen. So I looked at artists. This is a selection of directory entries actually for Birmingham in 1855, and we can see that artists are quite well represented, and in fact the whole of the Birmingham entry in Slater's, I believe it is, for 1855 has 55 artists in it, and a handful of those are photographic artists. So the predominance in that category is for painters and drawers and draftsmen and teachers of drawing. And we can see how photography starts to edge in to that sector, and it starts by being included in the artists category, but having an asterisk to say these are artists, but these are artists who work in photography. And it's also quite interesting when we see how in some parts of the directory the artists are are all categorised together, as you might expect, but in other parts of the same directory, they will be all tradesmen and professionals be listed in alphabetical order, and their trade or profession alongside their name. So you get both views. So it is interesting that when we're looking for photographers or photographic artists or artists of other kinds, they're cheek by jowl with small animal taxidermists and whitesmiths and tripe dressers. And in the case of Birmingham, gun and gun accessory makers. And so we see down here, John Johnstone, photographic artist of New Street, is right next to Maria Johnstone, a toy dealer, also of the High Street, but of a different part of Birmingham. So they may or may not be related. I mean, some of these people probably would have been, but we can see that photographers and other artists are right in there with all the other trades and professions. So they were first described as artists, asterisk, photographic, and then they were described as artist, parentheses, photographic in some other directories. Then they made a massive leap to having their own category, which was the artists would be in the A's, of course, and in the P's you would find photographic artist. And what's quite telling is that as the 1860s, 70s, 80s proceeds, the number of artists shrinks and the number of photographic artists expands. So photographers really moved into the territory that had previously belonged to artists, to painters. So they became photographic artists, and only later on did they become photographers. There were a couple of excursions which I find actually quite fascinating. One is that there was a short trend of calling them photographist. I can't say that with the right cadence, so presumably that's why they dropped it. But also, in terms of the development of the words, the "ist" suffix comes straight from the daguerreotype, because they were always called daguerreotypists. I don't think there was anybody that I've ever found who was a daguerreotyper. So somebody who makes a daguerreotype had to be a daguerreotypist. So that, I think, is probably where that carryover comes from. The Americans did things a little bit differently, oddly, perhaps, in that they went through a spell of calling their photographers heliographers. So they presumably were saying, not only do we make photographs, we make pictures with light, but we make pictures with sunlight. Well, they've got more sunlight than we have in Northern Europe, so that probably makes sense. And there was one directory which threw up an anomaly that shows the kind of inconsistency, and this was Kelly's of 1899 for the Derby, and they list Winters as photographic artist, but they list Gibson and Son, which is this guy over here, of St Peter's Street, as photographer, just in the same directory. So I'm not quite sure who has the say when they're putting these directories together as to how you would be listed, whether they went to the organisation, went to the company and said, what should we put you down as, or whether they just kind of wing it, really. So it was a fairly patchy move, partly because there were many directories developing at the same time. Right. I haven't been able to decide. This is a very poor kind of screen grab, and this is my scan of an existing cart. So that probably is the reason for the difference in quality, although that is pretty well faded. But for anybody who hasn't seen a vintage Winters picture photograph before, this is how beautiful they can be. And bearing in mind that these are, I'm just going to take one out to hold and show you, although this isn't the Winters one, but that's the size of a carte de visite, right? So I'm going to talk about cartes de visite now, having flagged them up so much. So cartes de visite came along because they were, well, the format was invented in 1854 by Disdery in Paris. Before that, you could have portraits of any format, but there wasn't really much standardization. The daguerreotypes were sort of divisions of plates, and then normal studio photography was also divisions of plates. So glass plate, a half plate, quarter plate, and so on. But in terms of what the clients could expect, every photographer really did their own thing. And this was partly to do with the difficulty of producing. It was a technical process. All the earlier processes were extremely technical, and meant that the time it took to create that made it a kind of an experience, almost a one-off, even if the photographs could be reproduced. But Disdery's invention, I mean, other people had tried it. It was called a carte de visite because it's the size of a calling card. I don't think there's much evidence that they were really seriously taken up as calling cards. They were used as a medium of exchange, but that wasn't their primary function. They couldn't have existed without the invention in 1848 by Frederick Scott Archer of the wet plate to collodion process, and that shook up the development, the processing of photography. It went from a really high, well, in some cases dangerous. I've seen some contemporary newspaper reports of young children being left unattended in a photographer's studio and dying because they came too close to the wrong kind of chemical. Wet plate collodion, although still needing some care, was a massive leap forward in user friendliness. That meant that the time it took to create a print was massively reduced. That, and what Disdery did was to create or have built for him a multi-lens camera which would take maybe 3 of one pose or 4 of one pose and then 4 of another by splitting the plate. So they would have 6 or 8 or sometimes even 12 lenses on the front of a camera. Meant that one sitting with just a couple of poses could generate a negative which, once you print it several times, then massively increases the number of prints you could get in quite a short space of time. So Frederick Scott Archer invented this process. I have to add that there was some friction at the time because Gustave Le Gray, a French artist, also claimed the process. But I'm fairly confident that it was Frederick Scott Archer, so he's something of a hero. Although he died in poverty, but he chose, unusually, not to attach his name to it. So there was no process called the Archero type, whereas before you'd had the Woodbury type and the daguerreotype and so on. So he had no license imposed on this process. It was freely available to use, which meant that very soon every photographer in the world had access to it and wanted to use it. So the effect on Disdery's carte de visite was that we had a demand, which I'll speak about in a moment. We had the ability to meet it, and we had a standardized format that everybody could very soon understand. So this is an example of a carte de visite. This is quite a late one, so this is probably early 1890s. Winter had a very nice habit of every time he won a medal, he'd stick it on the back and put a date on it. So we can say with a high degree of certainty that this cannot be before a certain date. And I think the latest date there is probably 89. 89, yes. So there are stylistic clues and clues about the object itself, which also date it to that. So it's a thick card. You can tell a bit that from here. The script changes, so those of us who are involved in looking at Winter's signature as it changed over the years, you could probably almost date it just from the signature. People who are interested in the fashions of the day could probably date the clothing. I'm not quite there yet. Interestingly, this is one which had the tissue protector still attached. So you obviously get the face and the reverse, and right at the top there you see a line where this tissue is gummed. So this is one of the things that really led me towards, really, are you an artist, or is Dara right? Are you perhaps an artisan? Because we can count the art 4 times here. So art photographer, artistic treatment, you would hope that was taken as read, but then on the tissue itself, an artist in photography and a dealer in works of art. So really, Winter has really nailed his colours to the mast. You can argue that this studio is in the business of using art to produce photography. So they have a standard format. There are a few variations. You have slimmer ones, smaller ones. When they go bigger, they eventually become large enough to be a cabinet card. But this was the standard format, which meant that millions could be produced. Which meant that publishing houses could get the contract to print these up. And some people like Marion and Company from Paris, they had offices in Paris and London. They had what looks like 40 to 50% of the studios sewn up in terms of supplying them with carts. So that kept alive that business of it being a standard format. That's another thing that kept the prices down, the costs down for the studios, and it meant that they could turn them out at very low cost. So it was a low cost, standard format that everybody could understand. It was something where it actually fell into some different categories, and I only tend to look at what I call domestic portraiture. Things like this, somebody in the local community being photographed for her family and friends, perhaps. There was another tranche of carts which were the celebrity cart, and those were Queen Victoria, Prince Albert, Gladstone, Disraeli, Abraham Lincoln, bishops and other churchmen, Sarah Bernhardt, and so on and so on. Well, I'm concentrating on this, but it meant that there was another income stream for studios like Winter's. If somebody hit the news and you could get hold of their cart that had been produced and published, then that was something else you could sell from your shop window. And when you think that most people would never have seen a photograph of that person because newspapers couldn't print photographs. They wouldn't be able to print photographs until halftone came in much later on. So, if you want to see a picture of Sarah Bernhardt and you're in Nottingham or London or wherever, then you'd have to go down this celebrity cart route very often. You'll see on the back of the cart, as I say, this one is full of medals and awards. So this is the marketing area of the cart. It's where you can really tell your clients what you're about and what they can expect. So if you're looking around Derby for the best photographer to photograph your auntie or your cousin or whatever, then this is a recommendation in and of itself. Now, when Disdery created the first cartes de visite, the first one was actually a little bit earlier than this, and there is again one of these apocryphal stories that tends to float around photo history. that the Emperor Napoleon III was on his way to review his armies in northern Italy and stopped in Paris on his way through and had his photograph taken. And there's nothing that that people like more than a celebrity, and that was a trend-setting time. So carts in France took off and very, very quickly arrived over in London. So as soon as Queen Victoria decided she liked it, then that really kick-started the carts in this country. And there was again another slightly apocryphal thing. There was a phrase that was current at Osborne House when Queen Victoria was there, that the Queen could be bought or sold for a shilling, which is it has a double meaning. One is that if you had an unusual cart that she wanted, then that would buy you access, maybe only for half an hour, but you get to see the Queen because you got the cart she wanted. Or maybe more prosaically, you could actually go almost anywhere and you could buy any pictures you liked of Queen Victoria for a shilling. So this is an example of a winter's rate card, which is quite an unusual survivor, and it shows immediately how cheap these were. So this is actually must be quite late on because this is quite expensive compared with some. But we should. I haven't looked into it, but we should be able to date it roughly from the negative number. So that's going to be fed back into the machine, and we'll see if we can spit a date out. So 3 for 3 shillings, 6 for 5 shillings, or 12 for 8 shillings, and tuppence for postage. Wow. So it's nice also that we have the name of the sitter on the top there. So if we ever find that negative, we'll be able to put a name to it. So, and this is the kind of thing we really enjoy when we have our conversations in Winters. It's trying to make these connections, trying to, as a lot of you do, is you find something and what does that mean for the other things that we find. So going back to the kind of things you'd spot on a carte de visite, I included this French, is it French or Belgian? I don't know where Hamburg is, the place where the hat was named, I imagine. Now, they use in French the term atelier, which translates, actually they're almost hedging their bets, because atelier is translated both as studio and as artisan's workshop. So maybe the French don't quite know. When we use it, when we do see British studios use photographic atelier as their sort of style instead of studio, they're not only saying it's a studio, well, we already know studio is borrowed from artists, but they're going a step further and saying we're even more artistic than people who say studio. So that was an interesting sidelight. But what we do see in all of these, and none of these are Winters, I have to say, is we see the same motifs repeated over and over again. The idea that we are placing ourselves as artists, and we're going to prove that to you by showing you a palette with paintbrushes and a marl stick and a portfolio and, of course, a camera. So that brings them all together. So these are very clear statements, even the ones that don't say it overtly, but some of them do. So Clouds up there, yes, in big letters, he's an artist. Photographic artist in this one. So they're very keen to let you know that however you may think of photography, you should think of it as one of the arts, not as it was first perhaps thought of, as an offshoot of printing. And in the very early days, before they really took off in terms of the directories, they would be placed as printers, or it's similar to printers, a very technical, reproductive type of operation. No, not expected to be creative. And if you think about the early work of William Henry Fox Talbot, most of what he produced in the very early days were photographs of statuary. So he was recording them. And in France, there was, following the revolution, there was a massive sort of desecration or vandalism of what the French regard as their patrimony. So the artifacts that relate to their history and their heritage. So they tried, some of them tried to get together and save those. And when photography came along, the government of the day, and this is early-ish in the photographic story, they created a team who went around with cameras to photograph things that couldn't be moved or things that were otherwise vulnerable. They called that the mission héliographique. So they were just trying to capture those things before they could be destroyed. So very much recording. And that's still obviously a major use for photography today. But when we think about artists, we don't always think about the guys who appear in the ranks of the trade directories. If you think about, if we say the word artist in Derby, we tend to think of people like Joseph Wright of Derby, who was in the 18th century. This is the work of a Birmingham artist called Benjamin Williams Leader. And he was not one who appeared in a directory list, and he was a very prolific exhibitor. I think he exhibited 141 times at the Royal Academy. So these artists did exist, and there were Royal Academicians in Derby, as there were in Birmingham and all over the country. But they're not the artists whose territory is being usurped by photographers. So I include this as part of an illustration of the hierarchy of artists, that photographers were in a different place. Photographers produced, artists whose space was being usurped by photographers, produced things like this. They produced miniatures and they produced silhouettes. Now the things that these two methods, media, have in common with photography is that they're intended to be quick, and they're intended therefore to be a bit cheaper. So if you wanted the big canvas painted in oils, then you weren't in this league, apart from using perhaps using miniatures as a forget-me-not. But miniatures, perhaps of lower quality than this, were very much the only way that a lot of people could get access to having a likeness that they could then share with somebody else or display. There was an interesting technology which was sort of halfway in between these that occurred in France in the late 18th century, called a physionotrace, where they would create a silhouette, and then the real artistry came because at the time, live, the miniaturist, the artist, would paint that as if it were a proper profile portrait. So that was, they're always pushing for some way of creating and sharing likenesses. And so we start to see a build-up of demand for photography. And this is an illustration of a couple of things. One is one of the restrictions and limitations of photography. And the other is how photography, and this is late 1850s, early 1860s, how that borrowed almost overtly from the styles and poses and habits of portrait painting. So one of the restrictions is that the lens would be at its best in the centre of the frame. So if you wanted a full-length portrait and the face is up here, you'd start to get a fall-off in quality. So it's actually many of the best images are ones where the sitter is sitting. And the other thing is that, as we'll see, it's nice to be anchored against something, because these are days when otherwise you might wobble around. But generally, the pose and the props are very much borrowed from the world of painting. And we see that again. We see the being anchored, so the model's not moving around. And this is a Winters one, so yes, remember. And also the language of painting, the language of art. There's more going on here than just a woman standing grasping the back of the chair. This is a reference to the original empty chair. So somebody's missing, and there's an album there. So this is about memory and loss. And these are things which regularly are explored in painting and regularly explored in art. How regularly are they explored in a little 3-shilling card? Probably not that regularly. So, in terms of Winters, yes, artist. Okay, we'll let you have that one. At the same time, there's an aspirational dimension to portraiture. Clearly, we can point at portraits that have been created back for hundreds and hundreds of years, pre-Renaissance, Renaissance, and so on. One of the things that happened in the late 18th and the 19th century was the habit of immortalising mayors and aldermen and worthies of civic corporations in oils. And this, to me, looks kind of like one of those. It looks like the sort of heavy, serious portrait that you might find in Sheffield City Hall or Leeds City Hall or something. It also looks a bit like Brian Blessed in a certain light, but that might just be me. Sadly, no sound. There we go. I just wonder what sort of... was he the large character in the studio that he appears to be in this? Maybe it's just beard envy, I don't know. Again, this is a pose. It's very unusual in the thousands of cartes de visite that I've looked at. This sort of dual pose is very unusual, and it's something that you would readily find in portrait painting. It appears to be a mother and daughter. We can't really know, but it has that sort of almost wistful quality that we see in some really artistic treatment of paintings. So again, one of the great joys of looking at all these photographs is not so much or not just the things that we can find out from them, but the things that we are left wondering about. Some of the carts, apologies for the state of this, obviously you get, if it's not perfectly washed, you do get chemicals leaching out over the years. So I don't think she had this many freckles, but some of them are just genuinely beautiful objects. Some of them not so much. So this, I'm pleased to say, is not a Winters photograph. So this is from a chap called James Smale in Dartmouth, and he photographed a lot of sailors. He was also the official photographer for the Dartmouth Royal Naval College when that came along. But yes, sometimes, you have to work with what you're given. And I think portraiture has always been like a dialogue between the sitter and the artist and the audience. And in this case, the sitter is not participating in that at all. I also wondered whether there were any recognised artists who then became photographers. And I trawled through the directories to see if that happened with listed artists who then became listed photographers. Occasionally, but very, very rarely. And even then, they were not the kind of artists who would have garnered really, if you like, top-level recognition, either in their own time or later. But this is a a cabinet card, so slightly larger, by Nadar. So Nadar was like the trading name of a guy called Tournachon, Felix Tournachon, and based in Paris. And he had been a very successful artist and painter, portrait painter, and then turned his hand to photography. And he was one of the people who went along with Baudelaire when Charles Baudelaire said that from this day art is dead because of the arrival of photography. And he was very much was in that camp. But then, when the ability to participate in volume photography and hit the mass market came, he jumped on that. He opened a big studio with his, you can just about see his signature down here. That was a very famous kind of brand trademark, and that was plastered across his studio. And because of his reputation and his standing, he was able to photograph some extremely well-known people. So he photographed Sarah Bernhardt, he photographed obviously Ivan Turgenev, and Baudelaire, and lots of other people. So that's an example of somebody who is unequivocally an artist, who not only turns to photography, but turns to the kind of commercial, mass-market photography. The fact that he died in poverty, that's maybe more to do with his business acumen than anything else. And I've touched on the medals that appear not only on Winter's cards, but on many other. Not a lot of them go for it as much as Winter's did. He really loved to pile the medals on. You know, anything he could win, he would put on there. Is there a sack race from 18? So it went on there, and that was, as I said, that was to show his clients that he had standing and he had reputation, and that he was being judged by the people who knew something about art. And that would come from him submitting pictures that were nothing to do with the bread and butter of the studio. So these were things that he went to create especially for exhibition. So the fisherman with the empty net, I can't remember what the title of the picture is. It does have one. So this is a print, so this is my photograph of a print which was lodged with the stationery office and then has found its way into the National Archives at Kew. And it's there to prove ownership down the line. But this is one of the photographs that he would have used in order to win one of the awards that would go on the back of his cards to generate more business for him in the future. So I wonder what clients expected when they went to Winters or to Brennan or to Malls or any of the other studios. Did they expect to be treated like an artist's sitter, or did they expect to be herded in and out? We know that from auction records that Camille Sylvie, who was a very prolific carte de visite photographer in London, in Portchester Row, had upwards of 30 clients per day per studio room, and he had multiple studio rooms. So his business was sometimes turning over more than 100 people a day. And if you compare that to what a portrait painter in oils could do, or a daguerreotypist could do, there's no comparison. So if people were expecting to come to Winters and for their, even a carte de visite, no, not just a normal everyday or a more high class, shall we say, print, but the carte de visite, they were expecting for that to be treated as if the photographer was an artist. Now, when we look back over the tens and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of carte de visites, and in fact, between the 1850s and 1860s, just in Britain alone, over 1 billion cartes de visite were produced. And so they can't all have been artists. Not every photograph will have been great art. But the expectation was from the clients that they would be treated as if they were. And a lot of the experience of clients was to do with how good the photographer and the studio were in making them feel that while still getting them in the door and out the door as quickly as possible. And that was made possible by the format and by the experience of the photographer. Some photographers came into the sector from a background of being an artist, but many didn't, and especially once the processes became easier. Once wet plate collodion had been succeeded by dry plate, which was something you could buy off the shelf and didn't require all the sort of drying time or tack time, then it made it so much easier. And photographers could really ramp up the throughput. And that's my rather middle of the road conclusion, that the clients expected their photographers to be artists, and sometimes they were and sometimes they weren't. So that's about as close to a definite answer as I can get. Thank you.